Hi there. It's good to see you rather than on the Zoom, on a video now. Normally on the model course, when we're not online, one of the sessions that I'd run is something called Internal External Frontiers. And it's probably, again, if the Kingdom of God, Kingdom of God, Kingdom of Heaven is my kind of uh, most loved theological theme. I suppose the internal external frontiers is the topic that I think is probably most dear to my heart, in that it's something I feel if you're going to be involved in any kind of Christian leadership, Christian discipleship, actually this topic of internal external frontiers is one of the things that over kind of 40 years of being in church leadership and church ministry, um, uh, actually this is really important. So what is internal external frontiers? Well, I suppose in life you'll find all kinds of challenges. There'll be all kinds of challenges that will come your way, that will be unexpected challenges that you, at times, you'll rise to the challenge and you'll overcome it and you'll win. Sometimes you'll face the challenges and you'll struggle and you'll battle, but maybe you might not kind of win. But I suppose the greatest challenge that you face, that you ever will face, is yourself. Actually, it's not the stuff out there that is the most challenging thing. Sometimes it's the stuff in here that's most challenging. Which is why this thing about internal and external frontiers is thinking about, I suppose it's thinking about self leadership. Some leadership gurus would say that the most challenging leadership uh, thing that you'll face is how to lead yourself, how to lead your own motivations, your own thoughts, your own drives, your own kind of, I suppose, uh, internal fleshly sin life. Kind of, if you can't win here, if you can't see God's victory here, why would you imagine that you want to see something happening out here? So, what I want to do in the session is to think about uh, internal, external frontiers. How do we lead ourselves? How to lead ourselves well? So I'm not sure if you've ever seen a film called Dances with Wolves, and it's a film that it's quite an old film now, with Kevin Costner. And when I was a child, if you watch a film on television, it was kind of my first television was black and white. But on Sundays there'd be westerns. There'd be western movies, and what you'd have is you'd have cowboys against Indians, and the cowboys were always the goodies, and the Indians were always the baddies, um, and obviously that wasn't how the West was won. Actually, probably now we look back at history and think it was more ethnic cleansing than a civilization coming to those places. But there was this film. I'm not sure. Again, normally I'd have a PowerPoint. I'm not sort of wonderfully great on PowerPoint, but uh, Kevin Costner in this film called Dancing with Wolves, and it was a film where he was fighting in this. I think it was the Civil War. He got severely injured. The medical medic on the kind of battlefield was going to amputate his leg, and he thought, well, he doesn't want to live his life with one leg, so he kind of squelches his kind of boots back on, jumps on his horse, and heads out to the enemy line, kind of arms open, expecting to be shot and die. Um, uh, but his kind of fellow soldiers thought attack was happening. They followed behind him. The battle ensued. They won this incredible battle. He did live. He saved his leg, and as a reward, he got to be able to choose wherever he'd like to be posted. Um, and he could be posted anywhere. He could be posted back in the big cities, in some of the barracks, in the kind of the training places. But he chose to be on the frontier. And so the next shot in the film, you see him riding into this kind of one horse town, and right on the frontier, right on the edge of civilization. And he goes into this to see the sergeant there, and who's a slightly drunk person, and he says, kind of, why would you want to come here if you could have gone anywhere? Be posted. Why would you come here? And he says this in the film. He says, the frontier won't always be here. I wanted to see it while it still existed. And in his mind, he had this idea that civilization was advancing from the east coast to the west coast, and and that frontier, you had civilization behind it, but you had the Wild West, and he wanted to see what it was in this phase of history to be on that frontier as civilization advanced. And I suppose in some ways it's a bit like that for us in our leadership, in our the things that we do, in our private personal lives. I think we all have frontiers. We all have kind of civilization back here, things that we're used to, things that we kind of are happy to do, and then there's things out here that I suppose are, well, they're unknown. They're a bit wild. Uh, it would be a bit foolhardy and adventurous to be on that frontier. But in some ways, I think for myself, in the way that I've lived my Christian life, is you probably do at times need to stand on the frontier. Stand at the frontier and say, I've experienced God in these kinds of ways, and I could just stay here in my prayer life, in the things that I do, in my witness to my friends. I could just do the things that I've always done. But what if I stood on the frontier? Maybe this kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, actually could advance. Maybe this kind of world that needs to be changed by the love and the hope and um, uh, the forgiveness of God. Maybe if I stand up to the frontier and try things that I've not tried before, push myself a bit, maybe the kingdom of heaven could advance a bit more than it has done. So you might say, well, Tim, kind of what exactly do you mean by that? And I suppose if I was to give you a few things that I think, I think, I mean, I don't know, for example, praying. So some people might say that in praying they find it hard to pray out loud. For some people, saying, I don't mind praying by myself. I don't mind praying in my own head. Uh, I can do that. But if I had to pray out loud, that feels like a frontier. It feels like that's something that I, yeah, I couldn't do. I wouldn't do. What if I got it wrong? What if people misunderstood me? What if it, yeah, the words I use, and sometimes we can feel, oh no, I'll just stay here. I'll just stay praying quietly by myself. I won't pray with other people. And that's an understandable fear that kind of what would people think. I remember a story from someone called Tony Campolo over at the States many years ago, and he said about this lady from a downtown part of a city became a Christian and joined this rather kind of middle class kind of church, and there was a time in the service where people could pray, and this woman who come from a really kind of broken background had encountered Jesus. She just, when there was the chance to pray out loud, she just prayed out loud, and kind of it wasn't kind of grammatically very well formed prayer. In fact, she did swear a couple of times. Um, and at the end of the service, an old gentleman came up to her and kind of to tell her off and say, kind of, lady, do you know kind of what bad kind of grammar you used, and do you know you swore in your prayer? And this lady just turned to him and said, well, do you know what? I wasn't talking to you anyway. And that's the reality of prayer, isn't it? We're not talking to people, and the fear of what would people think is like a frontier that we need to push through. And I wonder whether for you, you might say, well, actually, I've got, I've pushed that, and I can pray with people, and there is something wonderful about praying with Christian friends and feeling that our faith is encouraged. But maybe you're happy to pray by yourself. You're happy to pray with your Christian friends. But what about these people that go and pray on the streets? That's like slightly scary for me. Kind of the people who would actually go out and would offer to pray for people, kind of random strangers, and you might say, oh, look, that would just be too scary for me. But yeah, maybe there's a time where we say, I'm going to give it a go. I'm going to do that. Maybe you're the kind of person who, yeah, you just love to pray for people on the streets, but the reality is, you know that you probably won't ever see them again. And in some ways, the risk factor of praying, uh, although it's kind of embarrassing to start off with, maybe if the prayer doesn't work, again, there's no jeopardy there for you. But what if you were to, I don't know, offer to pray for people in your workplace, people who sat in the desk next to you, people who are part of your family who aren't yet Christians? What if you were to pray for them? Oh, suddenly think, oh no, that's a frontier because it feels again slightly scary. What if I pray for somebody who's my work colleague and God doesn't answer that prayer and I've got to see them the next day and the next day? Or what if I pray for my mum or my dad who's not yet Christian and again, kind of I'm still going to see them and we back off from prayer because we feel scared and we feel what people think and and so there's things like prayer that I think can be a, a frontier. There's other things that I think that we could look at things like, um, I don't know, evangelism or witnessing. I think there's times where we have uh, times where we think, uh, okay, I'm prepared to say, yeah, God's done something in my life at home group. Again, for some of you, that might be a big deal of actually being that vulnerable in a home group. But for some of you, say, okay, I'm prepared to witness to what God's done in my life amongst my home group. And occasionally I might say, He's answered this prayer, or I read this Bible verse and I found some peace here. But I'll just keep it, again, keep it safe, keep it with my home group. But what if you, again, with your work colleagues, when they were saying how stressful they're finding things at the moment, and you're just a witness that actually I do find things a stressful time, but do you know what? I find that God gives me peace. You might think, the kind of thing, weirdo, kind of spiritual, kind of, and again, through fear, we might just witness to God's activity with our Christian friends rather than our non-Christian friends. Um, for some of you, again, even just talking about Jesus, you can talk about your spiritual journey and about spiritual help, and it can sometimes feel like a kind of it's a little add-on. But as soon as we start talking about Jesus, and Jesus is the one who can bring new life, and Jesus is the one who can bring us hope. Oh, and that's a bit too strong. I'll just stick with the spiritual journey. But there's salvation is found in no other name apart from the name of Jesus. So and then for some people, maybe you've never had the chance to share your faith with somebody. You've never had the chance to pray for someone to become a Christian for the very first time, and to see that wonderful new birth. And again, I don't want to ask my friend to become a Christian. I don't want to take that step because what if they say no? And so we never sometimes have the wonder and experience of experience all that God has because we stay in the civilization that we know. I wonder if there's things like spiritual gifts that we think, well, I'm okay with caring for people. I'm okay with um, working at a food bank or at a toddler group because I can show Christian compassion that way. But if I was to start to use spiritual gifts, to start to maybe a prophecy that I feel God's saying, or share a word of knowledge, or pray for someone to be healed. Again, that I'll stick within my comfort zone of love and compassion, but maybe I won't use a spiritual gift. Maybe I won't prophesy, or I won't take the risk to in my prayer life to speak in tongues. Maybe there's spiritual gifts, and you know that for yourself. That's like a frontier. There's all this way in which God's kingdom could come, but you need to be brave and bold to stand up to that frontier. I wonder in leadership whether, again, you're happy to lead yourself and maybe a couple of friends in a prayer triplet. But or what about leading a small group? Or that would be a bit much. Or what about leading a pastorate? What about leading a worship service? What about leading a youth activity? And again, for our leadership, well, I'm happy to do that with a few people, but as soon as it gets to be 5 or 10 or 20 or what, whether it was kind of leadership of a congregation. Oh, I'm not sure if I could do that. And again, we stick within our comfort zones, and maybe God challenges us to step and say, "Is this a frontier that um, you can do?" And I suppose for me, again, if I was to just share a personal example of how this works, is public speaking. I know for me, public speaking was a real frontier, talking out loud. At school, I had dyslexia, which meant that if you had to read out loud, or reading per se, but actually reading out loud, it was always super awkward because you'd open the book and the words would like jump around and you'd be trying to read them and a sense of panic and fear because you knew that everyone else was looking at the same book as you were looking at. And as you read it and as you made a real hash of it, you could hear the little giggles going around the class. And so reading out loud, speaking out loud, yeah, was always something that was it was like a real barrier, a real frontier to me. And I know when I came up to university in Bristol, and I made the choice to say, God, I really want you to work in my life. I want you to be Lord of everything. I really want to step up to that frontier to see your kingdom come. And I can remember when I was in Hyatt Baker Hall residence, and I remember God challenging me to say, maybe it's through the book of 1 Timothy, and it says, for I've not given you a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power and love and self control. And I remember thinking then, oh, if God's not giving me timidity, I wonder where that's come from. Was it the devil? Was it my upbringing? Uh, was it the dyslexia that kind of? And so I thought, I really prayed, and I really felt that God gave me some breakthrough. That I needn't be timid, I needn't be fearful. And sometimes when you feel that you've had breakthrough, God gives the opportunity to show whether it's true or not. And I can remember that week getting a phone call from the president of the University Christian Union, and he said to me, "Oh, Tim, on Saturday night at our kind of CU meeting, I wonder if you could do the Bible reading for us." And there's about 300 people in the university CU in those days. And again, I'm on the phone, and they ask, "Will you read out loud in front of 300 people?" And my instinctive reaction was, "No, sorry, I don't read out loud. I can't do that. Hang the phone up." And I suddenly got, I don't know if you do ever get this, I suddenly got this real pang of, oh God, I felt it gave me the breakthrough. I kind of said that I would do it, and I backed down. When it came to the frontier, I retreated back to what I was used to. And I, again, prayed this little prayer that, again, it's a really bad prayer to pray. God, I'll never do it again. I don't know if you've ever said that. Um, and having said that, probably about 20 minutes, half an hour later, I get another phone call. This time it was from the curate at the church that I belonged to. It was Christchurch Clifton. And again, the curate said to me, "Would you like to do the Bible reading on Sunday?" And this time, again, there's 700 people rather than 300. And this time I thought, "Do you know what? I can't say no." Even though I felt the fear, I said, "Yes, I'll do the reading. What is it?" And it was Pentecost Sunday, so the reading was Acts chapter 2. And if you know Acts chapter 2, it's got all these, and there were people there from Pamphylia and Phrygia and all these absolutely horrible names. And so Sunday night came, they announced the New Testament reading. I wander to the front of church in front of 700 people by the big bronze eagle. I start reading, and I make a total hash of it. I get the words all muddled up. I turn bright red. I wander back to the pew, just imagining if people are giggling or not, and they weren't. And as I sat there, I felt God say, "Tim, well done." Actually, I just felt at that moment, actually, that there was a breakthrough. There was a breakthrough that meant that kind of I stood up to that frontier. It was fearful. Actually, it didn't go super well, but I just knew that something had broken through. And since then, I mean, I do sometimes when I read out loud, I still get my words muddled up. But I know since then, there's been no fear of standing in front of people and speaking and preaching, and I've done that to hundreds, thousands of people, but I had to stand at the frontier. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you to press pause in a moment, and I want you to take a chance to reflect. And when you press pause, maybe just find a piece of paper or on your phone, uh, on notes or something. Just write down what would be three things if you felt that there was a frontier. So things that in your Christian experience that you were used to doing, but if there was a frontier that maybe this year, maybe over lockdown, maybe uh, yeah, in the next few months, if there was something you thought, I kind of know that yeah, I should be praying out loud. I kind of know that I should be witnessing just some little testimony stories from my non-Christian family. Maybe I kind of know that um, I should be serving a bit more. I should be using the gift of the Spirit. I'd love to prophesy. I'd love to speak in tongues. If there were things that kind of you thought there's a slight fear factor there, but you kind of feel, yeah, I'd love to break through on those. Um, get on your piece of paper, just write down three things that you might like to see some breakthrough. And then maybe, I don't know, with a friend or a mentor, just say to them, actually, in the next kind of 3 months, 6 months, next year, here's some things that I'd love to find some breakthrough. I feel slightly fearful. What will people think? What will happen? What if it goes wrong? But I kind of feel that there's something about God and His kingdom that we could move ahead. So if you do that, just for a moment or two, press pause, write it down, and then when you've finished, come back, press play, and we'll carry on. Okay. So hopefully you've got some things there. Now I know there's the challenge, and I know for myself there is the challenge of, am I supposed to be brave and doing everything? Um, and probably now at my stage of life, I have probably had a go at most things. So I've not let fear stop me. I've gone up to those frontiers and faced them. But in doing them, I've kind of found that some things really suit me, and some things I thrive in, and some things I excel in. And there's some ministries and gifts that I have that I know God's given me, and I need to use well. And I know there's some things that I know that I can do, and sometimes I have to do, but I know they do kind of de-energize me. So I'm not saying you have to do everything all the time, but I would say don't be held by fear. Don't be held by the unknown. And I know for myself, I just would give everything a go in kind of as a younger Christian and as a middle-aged Christian. But I probably know that now that there's some things like teaching. I love doing teaching. I think God probably has given me a little bit of a gift for it. Um, and I know that if I'm doing pastoral care, something like that. Actually, pastoral care, it's not particularly who I am. I can do it. I can be nice to people if I'm pushed. I can give some wise help. But I know that if I do some pastoral care visits, I know from my friend Dave. I mean, he just would love. He loves pastoral care, and if he gets to meet 4 or 5 people in one day, he comes back and he's really kind of buzzed by it. I know for myself, if I had to do a pastoral visit, I need at least a medium-sized bar of chocolate because I know it drains me. Whereas if I can do a training session at Muller's and at the end of 2 or 3 hours, I'm really kind of buzzed because you kind of found your sweet spot. So in self leadership, do find out who God has made you to be, but don't let fear stop you from seeking first God's kingdom. Now, the second thing I would say is that there is internal frontiers. So just as the same as there's external frontiers, there's things that I'm used to God working through me and working in kind of with me here, and there's things that I'm not used to over here, and we're going to push those frontiers. But I think on the inside, there's also frontiers. So on the inside, um, there's barriers, there's frontiers. Kind of, I've let God into this bit here, but maybe haven't let God in this bit here. I mean, I don't know, something like the Lordship of Jesus. I'm prepared to have Jesus as my Saviour. Tick. I want to be forgiven. I want to know God's my Father. I want to know His peace and His love. Yes. But do I really want Jesus as my Lord? Oh. Well, having Jesus as my Lord means that He's the Master. He's the Captain. He's in charge. You think, oh, well, I quite like being in charge. I've grown up knowing what it is to be in charge. What if I was to let Jesus be in charge? Ah, that feels like a bit of a frontier. But that first, I know at the age of 14, having had Jesus as my friend, actually, I said, Jesus, I genuinely want you to be Lord of my life, to shape my dreams and my relationships and how I use my resources and my finances and um, but I know, having said to Jesus, I want you to be Lord. There's times where I say, well, you can be Lord of this, this, and this, but you can't be Lord of this. You can be Lord of my time, but not of my finances. You can be Lord of my my studies, but not of my relationships. And again, there's times where we can limit. There's certain rooms in our internal life we're not allowing Jesus into. I don't want you to touch that that thing, or because that's too precious to me. I don't want to hand that. And I remember at Sunday school, a Sunday school teacher saying this: if Jesus isn't Lord of all, he's not Lord at all. If you're choosing what Jesus can be Lord of, you're still being Lord. And maybe for some of you, there's a lordship issue. Maybe for some of you, there's an obedience issue that God asks you to do things and you feel prompted by the Holy Spirit. And some things kind of it feels convenient and yeah, it feels good to do those. And maybe you're happy to be beaten. But there's some things that come with a cost or with a price. A bit like Jonah. Jonah, he was used to prophesying. We see him in the book of Kings. He's used to prophesying to Israel, and the nation seemed to be blessed. But when he had to go and prophesy to Nineveh, he said, I'm prepared to be Lord here and obedient on that thing, but I'm not prepared to be obedient on this thing. And it took being swallowed by a big fish and being vomited out to change his mind, to say, I'll be obedient in everything. And I wonder whether obedience is, again, it can be, I'll be obedient in this, but not in this. And there's like a frontier. What if I was to be obedient in everything? Well, that's slightly scary, that's slightly fearful. I think other internal frontiers, I mean, can be fear. I mean, sometimes it's fear that's because of things that happened to us in our past. make us a fearful person, we're fearful to move ahead. Maybe it's fears that are irrational, that somehow just come on you, and you know it's like a barrier. It's a frontier that you need to find God's perfect love that casts out that fear. Maybe with peer pressure and other people's opinions of you. Maybe you're fearful of what people might or might not think, and again, that what do people think of me becomes much more important than what does God think of me. Um, and again, it becomes like a frontier, a barrier. I know for many people, what's other internal frontiers? Fantasy, imagination. I know for some people, their fantasy lives are just again to escape from the reality and the difficulties maybe they face, that they disappear into this kind of fantasy world that again is sometimes just not helpful or not appropriate. Sometimes our imaginations are filled by inappropriate things that we watch on the telly or internet sites that we visit, and we know it's like it's an internal frontier. We know actually it's that isn't right. I need to let God in. I need to let His light and His love and His hope pervade that part of my life, because the imagination is the interface between uh, your your will and your spirit, um, and that's where God needs to be able to speak. And if it's polluted and uh, that is actually not going to work well. And for some of you, those internal frontiers are to do with fantasy, and for some people, maybe it is kind of past hurts. There's things that have happened to you, and it's left a kind of scar, and you've shut the door on it, and you hope it's going to go away, but you kind of know there's something inside that is festering away and is harming your ability to thrive. And it's like a frontier. Am I prepared to visit that place of pain, that place of hurt? Am I prepared to forgive the person that has hurt me? Unforgiveness, again, it's just one of those yeah, it just kills life. It's like a poison that goes through your system. Unforgiveness. And you think, well, Tim, but that person hurt me. It was unjust. It was unfair. And I know. And maybe they don't deserve to be forgiven. But for your good is a frontier. Can you face that and day by day make a choice? Today I'm going to forgive. Let them off the hook. Today I'm going to forgive. Let them off the hook. Today I'm not going to hold a grudge. Today I'm not going to look for a revenge. And day by day by day to find that again that frontier that we stand up to, and we find forgiveness. Again, if I was to give a little just personal illustration of an internal frontier that I faced, my dad was a vicar, my mum was a vicar's wife, and my dad, I mean, he just loved. I mean, he loved God and he loved the church. And what it meant was that when I was I think just only 2 or 3 years old, my dad went to theological college, and in those days, your family stayed at home, and you had this monastic experience of going to be trained to be a priest. And so, for 2 years of my early life, my dad was training at theological college. My mum was looking after me and my brother back uh, in Trowbridge, and well, I didn't see my dad. I mean, we saw him for a couple of hours on a Saturday, and my mum reckoned it was just enough time to really upset us. Um, and for 2 years, I had an absent father, and it wasn't because there was an affair. It wasn't because something had gone wrong. It was because he was serving God, and it carried on when he had his first kind of curacy and became a vicar. He was so wanted to please God that he was out every night doing church work, um, every Sunday. Um, and there'd be times where I don't know, my bike would have a puncture, and I would say, "Dad, can you fix my puncture?" And with me, and he just wouldn't have the time for me. And and I suppose I kind of grew up with this real sense of hurt and disappointment. And again, just before I came to university, I was on a Bible week, and just again felt God challenging me and saying, "Tim, that there's pain, there's hurt there, and unless you deal with that hurt, it's going to be like it's going to affect you, it's going to harm you, it's going to be like a lead weight you're going to drag around all your life. Will you let me heal it? Will you let me set you free?" And I can remember just asking mum and dad and saying to them, um, uh, I think this is a problem for me. I think, Dad, the fact that you weren't around has somehow it's knocked my self confidence. It's really affected the way that I maybe view God. And will you pray for me? And God bless him. By this stage, he'd seen probably a bit of the error of his ways, and he was really apologetic and asked for forgiveness, and Mum and Dad prayed for me, and as they prayed, I just felt again like I stood up to the frontier, and I just felt God kind of moving that, find some breakthrough, and my mum had a picture while they were praying of this kind of crazy paving footpath going down the garden, um, and in this footpath there was big slabs missing, and there were bits of my life where Dad should have been there, Dad should have been there, he should have been there. And as we were praying, mum saw these slabs appear, and she felt God saying, "Well, that I was there, and I was there, and I was there, and I was there," and again, just feeling that the love of God that couldn't change history, but could change my present reality, and finding as I stood up to that frontier, there was some internal breakthrough. So I wonder if I was to ask you um, again, just to in a moment press pause. Is there anything at the moment that you would say is like an internal frontier? Is there something that maybe you kind of know in your heart of hearts, if you're going to be the best version of you, if you're going to be the best Jesus follower, if you're going to be the most kind of becoming conformed to the image of Jesus, what would be those internal things that you know need some breakthrough? And it may be lordship, it may be obedience, it may be fear, it may be fantasy, imagination, it may be past hurts, it may be unforgiveness. But I wonder whether you could just press pause and maybe just put this time just two things to say. God, I just love to find some breakthrough in my life, some freedom, some hope. I want to have the bravery and the courage, not just to live in the kind of ways that I've been my own coping strategies and my own ways of managing, but I just want to find freedom in you. And so, why don't you just press pause and maybe write down two things that you feel might be those internal frontiers that you could find some breakthrough at the moment. Okay, press pause. I'll be back with you in a moment. Okay, so hopefully you've now got some external things that God might be working on, and some internal things that God might be working on. But what I want to say is that those two things aren't two separate things. It's not as though well, I'll work on that and then I'll work on this, or I'll work on this, then I'll work on that. Actually, both of those things are linked. Internal and external frontiers are linked. And what do I mean by that? I think that there's times where, well, I've got this little phrase: deeper in, further out. Deeper in, further out. Actually, the more you let God break through those internal frontiers, the more you're likely to see a breakthrough in those external frontiers. The more you see breakthrough internally, the more you see breakthrough externally. Deeper in, further out. The deeper you let God in, the further God will take you out. And I mean, I think maybe it was the same, partly that for me when I came to university. I haven't found that breakthrough with some healing with my relationship with my dad. Having made the choice, I want Jesus to be Lord, and moving away from home for the first time and coming. We lived in a little village of just 600 people on the Norfolk Broads, and coming to the big city to Bristol. Actually, there was the chance for me to live my life independently, but I chose to live with Jesus as my Lord. And as a consequence of those two things, I just saw some of the most incredible things happening that first year. And I just thought I was a little country bumpkin who loved Jesus. But actually, the number of people that became Christians, we had a university mission, and 100 students became Christians. And I led one of the follow up discipleship groups. And we just saw God do some amazing things involved with international students and seeing some people of real. I remember I taught the Minister for Education for Ethiopia. He came to this country. He didn't know how to cook. He always had servants to cook. He was in an Methodist International House in Clifton, and I remember just teaching him how to cook spaghetti bolognese and just student meals, and just talking to him about Jesus, this Muslim man, and again just having the opportunity to share that in ways that I never expected, and I kind of felt deeper in, further out. Actually, was there a link between the way that I yielded to God internally? Did that have a repercussion on the way external? And I kind of felt it did. But you might say, well, Tim, was it just coincidence? Is it just sentiment? Well, I think there's some good Bible kind of some good Bible images, Bible stories, biblical kind of examples of people who did let God deeper in, and when they let God deeper in, somehow they found God breaking further out. So what I want to do is I've got three good news stories and three bad news stories, and I want to just kind of share how these Internal external frontiers. If you let God break through internally, you can find some breakthrough externally. So I don't know if any of you on your little list put you'd love to see some people become Christians this year or the next few months to witness and maybe to pray the prayer with people. So um, here's Peter. Peter on the day of Pentecost. He stands up, he preaches, and 3,000 people become Christians. Wow, Peter, fantastic. Um, but what happened in the lead up to that? Well, you might say, well, in the lead up to that, he saw Jesus kind of die and rise again. Yes, he did. You might say, well, he's just been filled with the Holy Spirit. Yes, he was. But I think there was actually this encounter, which I think John, the gospel writer, felt was so important that he puts it like a little appendix on his gospel, John's gospel. It's in John chapter 21. And I don't know if you know the story, but Peter denies Jesus. When Jesus predicts that all his followers are going to betray him, going to deny him and run, Peter says, "Yep, these guys here, I know they're hopeless, they're weaklings. Oh yeah, I can imagine them running away. But as for me, I'm never going to let you down, Jesus. I'm never going to deny you. I'm always going to be with you." And he kind of has this bluster and this great promise to Jesus that he's the man. You can trust on me, Peter, reliable. And if you know the story, Jesus is arrested and people run away. And Peter, he does follow at a distance. And while Jesus has been tried, he's there in a courtyard and he's around this charcoal fire, just warming his hands. And people come up to him and say, "Oh, were you with Jesus?" "Oh, no, I wasn't with Jesus." And as a second person, "Oh, were you with him? You've got a Galilean accent." "No, no." I kind of, and a little girl comes up to him and says, "I'm sure you were with Jesus. I don't even know the man." And he calls down a curse on himself and the cock crows. And at that moment, he just, there's this big internal, Jesus, I let you down. I promised so much and I delivered so little. And I'm not sure how he felt when Jesus came back to life again and when he meets him and talks with him. Actually, I kind of wonder whether there's still this internal frontier that although the wonder of all that he's seen Jesus do through conquering death, he knows in his own personal life, I promised Jesus so much and I've delivered so little. And maybe Jesus knew that. And he knew that even being filled with the Holy Spirit, if that sense of denial and failure wasn't dealt with, that somehow it would come back to bite him. So John records in John 21 verse 15 these things. And again, it's early morning as Peter's fishing. Maybe there's a cock crowing on the shore. And again, just the sound of the cock crow just reminds him once again, I let him down, I let him down. He then sees this person on the beach as they've got this huge haul of fish. He dashes to the shore. He's sure it's Jesus. What's Jesus doing? He's got a little charcoal fire. In the Greek, it's the same word as the charcoal fire in the courtyard. The cock's been crowing. Here's a charcoal fire, and here is Jesus. The pain and the disappointment of denial is there, and Jesus knows that he wants some breakthrough. So here's the Bible, John 21, verse 15. When they finished eating, John said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Now, you might have heard all kinds of different sermons about this encounter before, but here I'm thinking it's internal. Do you love me? Yes. External. Feed my lambs. Do you love me? Yes. Internal. Take care of my sheep. Do you love me? I'm struggling with this, Jesus. It's like it's a painful internal frontier, but yes, Jesus, you know that I love you. The third time, 3 times denied, 3 times being restored. And Jesus says, external, go and feed my sheep. And so when the day of Pentecost comes, he's full of faith, released from fear, and full of the Spirit, preaches, and those people, thousands, become Christians. So that's Peter. I don't know if any of you said about prophecy, of whether prophecy was the thing you would like to see some breakthrough in. If you were to think about who is the greatest Old Testament prophet, I would say maybe Isaiah. Not just because he's got 66 chapters, but Isaiah has some of the most incredible prophecies. I mean, he predicts and prophesies Cyrus, who was going to be uh, the leader of the Persian Empire 200 years before he even existed, and prophesied he was going to rebuild Jerusalem. He prophesied about so many times about Jesus, the virgin birth, the Spirit of the Lord, the suffering servant. Um, uh, and here's this prophet, and you think, well, how did his prophetic ministry start off? Well, you have the first 5 chapters of Isaiah, and you have Isaiah prophesying, and most of Isaiah's prophesying is doom and gloom. He's kind of pointing at people and saying, "Woe to you! Woe to you! Woe to you! Woe to you!" And for 5 chapters, he's been prophesying. But in chapter 6, he then gets a encounter. He's in the temple and he sees the Lord. And in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 5, he's been saying, "Woe to you! Woe to you! Woe to you! Woe to you!" And suddenly he meets God, and he suddenly says, chapter 6, verse 5, "Woe to me! Woe to me!" he cried, "I'm ruined." Now, it's interesting here, he says, "For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live amongst a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Then one of the seraphs flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Who shall I send? Who will go for us?" And I said, "Here I am, send me." I don't know if you can understand this, but again, did Isaiah have an internal frontier? When he gets to see God, the Holy God, in all his glory, he suddenly realizes, "Oh, I know the one thing. I know the one thing that's wrong." He didn't say that I'm grumpy, I'm judgmental, like, I'm harsh, I'm kind of I'm unforgiving, kind of I've got lust and rage or whatever. He knows what straight away what it is. I'm a man of unclean lips. Actually, there's something about the way that I speak, the way that I talk, that isn't honouring to you, God. And now that I've met you, God, I realise, oh dear, I'm ruined because my internal frontier is. It's maybe criticism, maybe those first 5 chapters. Woe to you, woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. And something in his own heart became, yeah, you deserve it, you deserve it, you deserve it. And became a bit kind of, and maybe his lips, kind of his tongue needed to be touched with coal from the altar. And what happened was he found forgiveness. He faced that frontier of I know what's wrong. My lips, my speech is not great. And when he's healed, when he's freed, he breaks that frontier. And suddenly, internal, deeper in, who shall I send? Who will go for us? Here I am, send me. And he's propelled into this amazing prophetic ministry. Internal, external. Just the last one I would say would be a great little story of internal breakthrough, external ministry. Would be Jonah. Uh, Jonah is asked to go and preach to Nineveh, and of course he's disobedient. He says, "No, I'm not going to do that, God." And he tries to run away, tries to go to Spain for a holiday to escape from God. But God's too loving and he cares too much for Jonah to let him go. So he sends a storm and sends a great fish, and he's swallowed up. And as he sat in the stomach of this big fish, dangling his toes in the gastric juices, kind of being slowly dissolved, chapter 2 of Jonah, we see that he repents. He, rather than fleeing from the presence of the Lord, twice he says, "I will look to your holy temple." The God who's everywhere was somewhere, was in the temple. And in his prayer saying, although he could just see the internal stomach of the fish, in his mind's eye, I'm looking to the temple because God, I was trying to run from you, but now I'm running towards you. And that frontier of disobedience was broken through. So that when he's vomited out the fish, when he goes to Nineveh, he preaches the good news. And it says that 120,000 people, not to mention the cattle, are saved. Well, Peter did well with 3,000, but here's 120,000. And as there's breakthrough in obedience, there's a release in ministry. I mean, chapter 4 of Jonah is a fascinating kind of, there's a little question mark because there's another internal frontier. Jonah is grumpy. If you remember, he sits under he's grumpy and he says, "Oh God, I thought you were compassionate, loving, and these Assyrians, they just don't deserve it, and I wish I could die." And he's got this. He had the word of the Lord, but he didn't have the heart of the Lord. He had the word, I'm going to judge Assyria. And yeah, those Assyrians are mean, nasty, horrible people. But he didn't have the heart of the Lord. Oh, they've repented. I'm going to forgive them. Jonah's miserable. And there's another internal frontier that God tries to, with this kind of vine that grows to shelter him from the sun, this worm that comes to eat it up. And again, the sun shines on him and he wants to give it all up. And we don't really know the answer to that internal frontier. Did he submit to the heart of the Lord as well as the will of the Lord? But those three stories show us the deeper in, further out. Just as I finish, I suppose there is kind of bad news as well. If those are three good news, how when you let God deeper in, you go further out of ministry. What if you don't let God deeper in? What can happen then? And I suppose for me, the story of Judas it's just a fascinating story. I mean, here's Judas. He's one of the 12. He's chosen by Jesus to be with him. Judas would have seen all the miracles, would have seen the crippled people walking, the blind people seeing, even the dead being raised to life. Jesus would have seen all that. He would have been sent out two by two, and he would have cast out demons and healed the sick. He would have heard the Sermon on the Mount, he would have heard the great parables that Jesus taught, he would have seen God with skin on. I mean, you might think that if only I'd seen Jesus, my Christian life would just be super, super kind of red hot the whole time. But here's Judas, and in John chapter 12, we see that Judas had an internal frontier. Judas' internal frontier was that um, he loved money. This is in John chapter 12, verse 4. And it's when a woman has broken this jar of expensive perfume on Jesus' feet, and he starts to complain because it was really expensive. And it says this, John 12:4. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who had later to betray him, objected. Wasn't this perfume? Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages, a lot of cash. Then John says this as a comment. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. I'm not sure if you can get your head around that, but Judas seemed to be the treasurer. As this band of followers followed Jesus around the countryside, there was a common purse where you'd buy food or you'd pay for lodgings, and Judas looked after the money bag. But it turns out that he loved money. And here's Jesus, and he was stealing money from the common money bag. And you think, well, Judas, why would you want money when you've got Jesus there, God in front of you? Why would you want just cash to buy stuff? But there was this internal frontier that he just didn't break through. He didn't allow Jesus to touch his love of money. You can't serve God and money. And so in the end, when it comes to 30 pieces of silver or Jesus, 30 pieces of silver, he chooses the 30 pieces of silver because that internal frontier was not broken through. For some reason, he wasn't prepared to challenge his love of money. And I wonder for us sometimes whether there's internal frontiers, and if we don't challenge them, things could end badly. For Judas, it ended so badly. Although he repented and was remorseful, he did kind of commit suicide. And again, a tragic, tragic end. I'm not sure if you might have thought, well, my Christian life would have been just set up if I had seen Jesus, but if I couldn't have seen Jesus, to be part of the early church and to see this burgeoning, growing movement where the power of God was around, people were becoming Christians in their thousands, I'd have loved to have been there. Well, I don't know if you remember the story of Ananias and Sapphira, but if Judas had a problem with money, I suppose Ananias and Sapphira had a problem with celebrity or prestige. I'm not sure if you know what happens in Acts chapter 4 and 5, but when people became Christians and encountered the love of God, it just changed the whole perspective. And so people were just giving of their own money and own possessions so that anyone who was poor had enough to live on. And Barnabas had sold a field and sold a property and given the money. And obviously Barnabas had some kudos from that. And so Ananias and Sapphira, they had a field that they were going to sell and some property. And what they thought is that kind of we'll sell it and we'll give money to the church, and people will think, "Oh, Ananias and Sapphira, you're so spiritual." But what they decided in their heart was they would give the full amount. They'd keep some back for themselves. So they got the kudos of being seen as being spiritual, but it didn't cost them as much because they kept some back for themselves. And so they told a lie. And again, this is what happens in Acts chapter 5, verse 1. Now a man named Ananias, together with his wife Sapphira, also sold a piece of property. With his wife's full knowledge, he kept back some of the money for himself. He bought the rest and put it at the apostles' feet. Then Peter said, Ananias, how is it that Satan has so filled your heart that you've lied to the Holy Spirit and kept for yourself some of the money you received from the land? Didn't it belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? What made you think of doing such a thing? You've not lied to men, but to God. When Ananias heard this, he fell down and died. I think there's some slain in the spirit, kind of literally. Um, what was going on there? Well, when there's the power of God around, if there's any internal fault lines in our life, actually we are under maybe when the power of God's more evident around, we're under maybe slightly stricter judgment. And here's Ananias and Sapphira, and they'd lied, they'd twisted the truth, they'd kind of bent it to make it look one way when in fact it was another way. And okay, how much do we sometimes do that? We tell a story in such a way to make us look a little bit better, or we tell things in a way that pulls other people down to lift us up, or um, we just stretch the numbers. We become evangelistic. That oh yeah, I've got 20 people in my youth group when you've got 12, or yes, kind of 7 people became Christians when maybe it was 3, or yes, I've got a church of 1,000, maybe when it's a church of 700, we stretch the truth. Why? Because we want to look good in people's eyes, and it's an internal frontier. Unless we can deal with our love of money, actually, unless we can deal with our sense of power and celebrity and personal significance in the eyes of other people, that's a fault line. Unless we let the power of God further in, if we try going further out, it can end bad ways. And unfortunately, church history is littered with people, with church leaders. I mean, even recent church history of church leaders that haven't dealt with those personal drivers, whether it's money, whether it's sex, whether it's power. And when they haven't done that, there's the chance of things going badly, badly wrong. I can remember a church that I was part of had a treasurer, and he was a dear, dear old man, and he would faithfully serve being a treasurer, and he became a bit ill, and he had to pass on the accounts to another person. And when the new person was looking through the accounts, he kind of found that there was about £60,000 missing. And so there was a little kind of they had a little investigation, and they asked this old gentleman kind of, look, there seems to be £60,000 missing from the accounts. Could you tell us what it is? And for a little while he kind of tried to make something up, but eventually he broke down and he had to admit he had a gambling habit. Uh, and although he was looked like a faithful member of the church, he had this gambling habit, and he'd used his own money, and because he thought he could hide it, he started then using the church's money to gamble with. And again, there was just an internal frontier that he never sought any help. He never found some breakthrough. And again, I would say to you that deeper in you let God, you'll see God working. But if you don't let God touch those fault lines in your life, at some point, whatever Christian ministry you're involved with will crumble away. I mean, it's so sad. Just the last person, as I finished, is an Old Testament character, and his name is Jephthah. He's in the book of Judges, Judges chapter 11. And I'm not sure, the book of Judges is a slightly chaotic book, but here's Jephthah, and his dad has he spends the night with a prostitute, and gets the prostitute pregnant, and Jephthah is the child who's born, and so he comes to be part of his dad's family, but the true sons, the sons of his wife, bully him and make fun of him, and actually in the end they push him out of the home, and he leaves with this huge chip on his shoulder, being unloved and uncared for by his brothers and by his family. But if you know the story of Judges, the nation of Israel is invaded by an enemy, and because Jephthah's headed off into the wilderness, he's got a little band of discontents around him, which is like a kind of a mercenary army. And they say to him, Jephthah, will you come and fight for us to deliver us from this enemy? And you can hear him say, "Well, I thought you hated me. I thought you didn't like me." Obviously, he's had this past hurt. He's not handled, not dealt with. And even when he decides to go and fight, he kind of, am I worthy? Am I worth it? Kind of my own sense of self-esteem. And so he makes this really rash vow to God. Says, God, if you're with me and I go and win the battle, when I come back, the first thing that comes out of my farm uh, through the gate to meet me, I'll sacrifice it to you. So it's really kind of, I can't just trust you on to use me, God. My self-esteem is not quite that good. My most self-value has been damaged. So I want to, if you do something for me, I want to do something for you. So he goes and he does win the battle. He comes back home and the first thing that comes out of his house to meet him is his daughter. He's only got one child, his only daughter. And again, the sad and tragic thing is, he should have just said to God, I'm sorry. He should have just repented. But actually, what he does is he takes his daughter, he gives her 2 months to grieve the fact that she's going to die, and then he kills his own daughter. And you think God never intended that. In fact, the god Molech, the army just defeated, they worshipped Molech, and child sacrifice was part of what they were doing. And here he is, and he sacrifices his own child. Why? Because he had past hurts that he wasn't prepared to deal with, and it ends up in such, again, he has no other children, and a genealogy for the Jews was so important, and his line, his family just ends there. And maybe until Jesus came, he couldn't have found healing for past hurts, but Jesus has come, and we can find healing from past hurts. Like for myself with my dad, and maybe if I hadn't done that, maybe my own self-esteem would have bled through into my relationships, into my leadership, into my ministry and things I'm doing for God. And but having found freedom, I know that it's not going to turn around to bite me. Unfortunately for Jephthah, it did. So as I finish, you've listened really well. I would say this: in the life you have ahead of you, allow God to go deeper in internal frontiers. What are they? Face the fear, because it is a slightly fearful thing to be vulnerable and be open and to be honest with God. But as you go deeper in, you find that those external frontiers, you can break through, and you find that there's a fruitfulness and a fulfillment in your discipleship, in your leadership, in your ministry to children, in worship, in Bible studies, that somehow the life that is in here flows out through your words and your actions, deeper in, further out. I wonder if I could just pray for you as we finish, and because this is probably one of the most important lessons that I've learned. Because, and unfortunately, I've seen uh, in my own life times where um, I worked with two colleagues and we were doing schools work, and I mean it was probably one of the best times in Christian ministry that I've seen of the number of people becoming Christians, and real breakthrough, a real younger generation being raised up to serve God within our schools, and again for my two colleagues, a little bit of pride, a little bit of kind of jealousy kind of crept in, and I tried to challenge it, but uh, no, it just kept on being there, and eventually that ministry collapsed. And I know the pain of that has made me realise that I must take seriously any sense of pride, any sense of jealousy, any unforgiveness, any past hurts. I've got to let Jesus in, because if he doesn't, however much he wants to work through me, I can always be the weakest link and think I can fail. So let me pray. Lord, thank you so much for every person there who's been listening. And I just want to pray for them that they'll be brave enough to let you deeper into their lives, to realize what those barriers are, those frontiers are internally, and that they'd have the courage to stand there with the power of your Spirit, the love of you, Heavenly Father, and the camaraderie of Jesus to help you to win. And I want to pray that as you go deep into people's lives, they would know what it is to your blessing and your fruitfulness on things they put their hands to, in their relationships, in their families, in their churches, in their youth groups, in the teams they're part of. I pray in their ministries you call them to, Lord, they would know what it is to find that kingdom breakthrough as your kingdom advances into this world who desperately needs to know you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, folks. And again, thanks very much for watching, and we'll catch up with you again soon. Bye for now.